All right. I think we have approaching critical mass, so let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining us for this panel on looking at disinformation and exactly 1 month before the 2020 election. We think this is an incredibly important issue. My name is Scott Andes. I'm the Executive Director of the Block Center for Technology and Society here at Carnegie Mellon. I'll be moderating today's conversation. So this conversation is a part of Carnegie Mellon's AI discussion series, which first launched in 2017. The initiative really aims to bring policymakers and the general public together to gain insights on key issues relating to artificial intelligence, both positive and problematic. And this, I just want to say before we get going further, a real special thanks to George Durakos and Laura Alford that have been great partners in all this to sort of help this really come to fruition. Normally we do these events in the Rayburn building in DC, but as us and the rest of the world, we have become virtual, which actually has allowed us to really expand our audience to folks around the world. So we're looking forward to the conversation. This roundtable is a partnership between the Block Center for Technology and Society and the Center for Informed Democracy and Social Cybersecurity, which Kathleen Carley, one of our panelists, leads. You can learn more about our centers at cmu.edu, or obviously you could just Google us and see a lot of information about the work we do. So a little bit of housekeeping before we dive in. The audience will be muted throughout the panel. If you'd like to pose a question, there's a button at the bottom of your Zoom app, just the Q&A button. Please post your questions, and at the end of the session, we'll go through as many questions as possible. I should also say the event is recorded and is obviously on record. Later this week, we'll be sending along a link to the recording as well as a short white paper pulling together the specific things that state and local officials, as well as everyone else, can be doing to combat disinformation in this critical month leading up into the election. So a little bit of content on why we think this is such an important issue to be addressing and why we think this panel is of leading scholars, both policy and in academia, are sort of the right group to have the conversation. In my opinion, the issue we're about to talk about is one of the most timely and significant threats facing the country. And if the panelists do their jobs, which I know they will, you'll leave this conversation the same way I left when I had my first conversation about the topic with Kathleen, and that is utterly terrified. And part of me feels bad about saying that, given we all have more than enough already to be worried about in the current state of the world. But this topic genuinely belongs on that list. While the issue of disinformation is a growing concern across the board, the COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically accelerated the risk. First, through a consistent uptick in disinformation around the virus. For example, Kathleen's work here at CMU has shown that 45% of Twitter accounts discussing COVID-19 are likely bots. And in second, the pandemic will make the 2020 election and voting process a significant departure from the past. So the goal here of this panel is really twofold. One, we want to hear from leading experts on the current state of play of disinformation and online hate and other issues in social media. So who are the actors? Who are being targeted? What are the types? What's the current role of technology, and where is it successful and where is it not? So that's part one, because we think being informed is critical to get the job done on this topic. And then part two is what we can actually do about it. Now, to be sure, to effectively address this issue will require legislation and significant investment in the moderate and long term. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those things. But there's also a series of things that we can do in the immediate term. Some of them may seem small or simple, but the research shows they are effective. So we're going to talk about that as well. So without any further ado, I'd like to sort of introduce the panelists and kick it off. As one would expect with such stellar panelists, they all have very long bios, which I will not be reading, but you can feel free to take a look at in your free time. Instead, let me just briefly introduce them so we have more time for the conversation. So we'll start with Kathleen Carley. She's a professor in the Institute for Software Research, the director of the Center for Informed Democracy and Social Cybersecurity, or IDEAS, in the School of Computer Science here at Carnegie Mellon. Then we'll turn to Nicole Turner-Lee, who's a senior fellow in the Government Studies program at the Brookings Institution and director for the Center for Technology Innovation. Then we'll have a conversation with Jonathan Bisk, associate professor of language technology in the Language Technologies Institute, again at the School of Computer Science here at Carnegie Mellon. And finally, we'll turn to Daniel Castro, who's the vice president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation and the director of the Center for Data Innovation. Each panelist will begin with a 7-minute introduction to their work, and then we'll have a conversation. And as luck would have it, I'm not just the moderator, I'll be the timekeeper. So again, panelists, if you get a message from me, it's 6 minutes and 20 seconds. That means you're getting close to your time. We want to make sure that we have enough time to get to the audience's Q&A. So with that, let me turn it over to Kathleen, and thank you all for joining us.
Hello. So I'm Kathleen Carley, and I'll be talking to you about disinformation and some of the information and some of the work that we have done to understand how disinformation has been spreading during this pandemic. Most of us think that disinformation are just simply inaccurate facts. In point of fact, what we have found is that most disinformation is much more insidious than simply saying a statement that is literally untrue. It can take the form of deep fakes, although those are exceedingly rare currently, doctored videos, fake images, which occur every time there's a natural disaster. You get a megastorm picture, for example, to misleading anecdotes, satire, and of course, unsupported opinion. The most insidious types of disinformation are those that begin in the form, my friend said, or my uncle said that they know someone who. So for example, in the anti-vax campaign, when the most insidious disinformation comes in the form, my friend did not get her kids vaccinated and they don't have autism. Totally untrue, totally irrelevant. The key problem with disinformation, of course, is that it not only spreads, but it is spread and respread, often by bots, trolls, memes, and cyborgs. During the pandemic itself, it is often thought of as an infodemic or a disinfodemic because the amount of disinformation that has spread is orders of magnitude higher than we've ever seen before. Some accounts place the number at over 9,000 different types of bits of disinformation that have been spreading. In contrast, to give you a context, in most elections and in most natural disasters, the number of disinformation campaigns is on the order of somewhere between 7 and maybe 100 or so. Whereas we've got, thousands and thousands going on now. It is also increasingly political in nature. It is global, and it is often coming in the form of anti-US rhetoric from other countries that are spreading disinformation that is picked up internally and then increases the partisan divide. Social media at this point is so infected with disinformation that classic strategies of simply banning a message or banning a bot simply do not have the effect that they used to have, in part because if you ban it on Twitter, it will re-show up back up on Facebook. If you ban it on Facebook, it'll show up on YouTube and so on. Over the course of the disaster and over anything, disinformation follows the course of things. So of course, disinformation over the course of the disaster has started with medical errors, which peaked sometime in late March, to things that now have to do with conspiracies, which are actually ongoing throughout. In terms of who is spreading disinformation, most of the time it's people. People are way more likely to broadcast disinformation than they are to rebroadcast true information. But in addition, there are these things that we think of as fake news sites that are known for coming out and spreading disinformation stories. Many of those are conspiracy type stories. And around each of them are little armies of bots. And those bots are busy retweeting out those messages, which are then picked up by humans who then spread them more. The more lethal the disinformation, the more conspiracy-like it is, the more we find bots involved in the spread of that information. Disinformation, of course, has real consequences. Disinformation has been and is being used during the pandemic to actually foster the formation of hate groups. These groups have been growing in number and they have been coalescing. While hate speech itself is not a new phenomenon, nor is disinformation, the two together have led to these communities of hate forming who, if they get riled up enough, will actually engage in action in the real world. It has also led to a variety of polarization campaigns, and it has led to a growing anti-science sentiment. Polarization campaigns have been fostered through disinformation throughout the internet. They've occurred in every election. They've occurred in sometimes in natural disasters. They've certainly occurred in the pandemic. And these polarization things have traditionally in Western Europe and the US been aimed at anti-women, anti-LGBTQ community, anti-ethnic minorities, anti-science, and so on. Why is disinformation spread? Some people spread it for fun. For example, the picture you see there of the child was actually a tweet by a bunch of kids at a Manchester United game who sent it out basically, and they said that we brought my kid brother to this game and he's now lost. Help us find him. This engendered a massive manhunt. But that particular kid, that picture is actually the poster child for autism, and that kid was grown up at the time this was posted. Other people do it to alleviate boredom, etc. Some people also do it for money. Spreading disinformation is now a big money marketing thing, and there are actually marketing firms throughout the world and troll farms throughout the world who create and spread disinformation and can be hired to do so. It is also being spread by others to foster particular political agendas, to actually build communities that have a particular way of looking at the world, and of course to disrupt civil society. All of this is going on even as we speak and is not being stopped. In order to combat disinformation, there's a variety of things that can be done. You as an individual can play a role, such as by calling out disinformation when you see it, not spreading it even if you think it's funny, because other people will not know nor share your sense of humor. Countering disinformation itself with sarcasm and humor, and checking to see if the source is credible and looking for things like typos, gender mismatch, and so on before trusting what you're seeing. Fact-checking information by going to fact-checking sites and so on. All of those are useful things. From a state and local official perspective, we can also stop it by creating our own social cybersecurity teams. It's time, we built these systems and groups together that actually continually monitor the airwaves and look for trusted information. You can also counter it by building your own trust network of informed individuals around you who will know what trusted information you are sharing and help you share it. So having a neutral and authoritative voice is also important, as is maintaining and publishing a list of those low reputable or disinformation sites like I mentioned. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, NICOL. Well, next we'll turn to NICOL.
So thank you, everybody, for having me. NICOL Turner-Lee. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and the director of our Center for Technology Innovation, where we focus on regulatory and legislative policies related to the tech ecosystem. I'm also writing a book about the U.S. digital divide, which will come out next year under Brookings Press, that will touch upon what we're discussing today in terms of the perils and the promise of the internet going forward. So I'm actually happy that Scott invited me today because, as he mentioned, we're 1 month away from the election. And with that being the case, we also have some precedents when it comes to misinformation and disinformation around an electoral period. First and foremost, in 2016 was probably the most obvious and evident case of this type of egregious action when we saw people who were discouraged to go to the polls, and they were particularly people of color or other folks from protected groups. Now, the extent to which that actually, affected voter turnout is still being debated, but we do know that some folks stayed home from the polls based on what they had been seeing on the internet. And I think Kathleen is completely correct that much of what people saw were not actually real people, were bots generated by foreign interference, which essentially did, enough to really convince people to stay home. And I think as a person who's a sociologist and not an engineer or a computer scientist, that's a really relevant point as we approach this new election, and I'll tell you why. One thing that I think people need to understand about misinformation, disinformation, it's not necessarily inaccuracy when it comes to a fact. It is really the spreading of falsehoods that actually have some type of consequence or implication for people who may actually consume that. So think about it this way. You go back to the 2016 election, there was a use of a variety of forms of misinformation and disinformation that was deployed. One was obviously the structure was through bots, but one side of it was deep learning networks or neural networks. Some of you may recall that there were photos of Hillary Clinton that were darkened, that made her look mean, etc., that discouraged Black voters who already had some trepidation about voting for her to really stay home. There was a great article in the Wall Street Journal that actually covered that. There were topical misinformation, disinformation campaigns that were actually spread through these bots and other human interventions, where basically Latinas, for example, were often fed misinformation when it came to border security or immigration. There were groups that were particularly targeted. So there were cultural sensitivities in terms of demographic targeting. We saw women were more likely to be affected by disinformation or misinformation or believe it. The same with older people. At one point, I told my mother to stop sharing stuff with me because she was one of the leading reasons why we saw a lot of disinformation during the election period. And then finally, I would just say that there was this sense when it came to the 2016 election of dissuasion. And I really think that part of it is really important, because not only did we actually see people being discouraged from voting, but we also saw the dissuasion sort of clash with the settlement of the Voting Rights Act and the type of civil rights protections that certain groups had. And that is the reason I'm sitting here today as a person who's a technologist, whose work undergirds race, social justice, and technology. It's important to have these conversations going into this election. Now, what I would just suggest in my first offertory remarks is that this is a little different from 2016. Why is that? We've learned a lot. We've learned what these bots look like. We have researchers like Kathleen and others on this panel who are working on this issue. We've also learned to a certain extent to expect this. I can't tell you how many emails I get from different platform companies that tell me about the takedowns. And they're not small takedowns. You know, oftentimes there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of accounts that were inauthentic that were actually spreading this disinformation. But I think today, as we go into the 2020 election, we need to be very careful. And I'm going to close here, Scott, so we can move on. I think one of the reasons why we need to be even more sensitive to disinformation is because we have known about foreign actors when it comes to spreading the wrong information and falsehoods, the Chinese, the Russians, and other countries. But what we're also facing right now are domestic disinformation campaigns, some which are actually being placed at the White House in terms of the type of information that we're seeing now around COVID, some which may actually be coming out of white supremacist groups. What's more interesting about this wave of it as we go into 2020 elections is that we're seeing in this domestic use of disinformation that people are showing up at a variety of movements, whether it was the infiltration of the protests that came after the George Floyd shooting, or it may actually show up in the intimidation that happens at the actual polls and polling places. My friends, what I say to all of you, I'm worried, because if we think 2016 was a piece of cake, I think what we're looking at right now is probably going to be worse, and the worst nightmare that we've ever seen when it comes to reeling those pieces in. And I think what's more important is that we've got big rock issues. COVID-19, which has already proven to actually spread the type of disinformation that may discourage people who are highly susceptible, like African Americans and Latinos, from going to the polls for the fear of getting COVID. Or big issues of racial inequality, from policing to just general equity concerns that are also flooding the internet. And as a sociologist, as I wrap up, a lot of what we saw in 2016 was based on the historical legacies that were embedded in the truths of this country. People knowing more about us than we know about ourselves, and that was actually used to sort of glean these vulnerabilities that led to these type of massive surveillance, as well as persuaded people to stay home. As we go forward, I hope that we talk about in this conversation a couple of things that I think policymakers should be focusing on. One, what does content moderation look like? How transparent is it? Two, how are we actually exploring disinformation that actually happens within a domestic context? Where do we draw the line between domestic terrorism, domestic disinformation versus foreign interference? Because I think what's happening in this country is actually very real and tangible. And then three, I think there's an element that we should talk about, which is around free speech. Much of what we've actually seen when it comes to disinformation comes from our ability to use these platforms to express our authentic selves. And I hope that we get a chance to talk about this algorithmic amplification that actually ties into why disinformation, misinformation campaigns are so powerful. And finally, I would just say this to the legislators, to question the extent to which you're actually undergoing a disinformation educational campaign. And we're actually seeing that work out in campaigns like Stop the Hate, that has been seeded by NAACP and other civil rights groups. But it's very, 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 very important that we include information about misinformation, disinformation into our own electorate's understanding of influences that actually can happen online. So I'm going to stop there, Scott, in terms of my opening remarks, but I hope that we come back, because I think there are civil rights implications, and some of which we don't have the tools to litigate the type of discriminatory and racist outputs that will actually happen if disinformation and misinformation becomes out of control. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Nicole. Now we'll turn to Jonathan to talk us a little bit about the current state of technology.
All right, you can see that, Scott?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. So hi, yeah. So I first of all, thank you for sort of including me in this. I think basically everyone's going to be hearing from the really important, smart people, like everything Nicole just said, everything Kathleen just said. I'm really only here to sort of provide a little bit of a sense of what the kind of research frontiers look like in terms of trying to kind of get some of these signals, or maybe put a little bit more context on what we mean by bot. So we oftentimes talk about bots, and I want to distinguish between something that's completely generated by a machine versus something that's actually a human behind the scenes. And so I think that a lot of us are maybe thinking that what we're seeing is something like this. So this is some work that we had done a couple years ago where you completely generate a fake news article. And so this, I've said, I want it generated today by Paul Krugman in his voice and in support of Trump. And it goes on to basically mirror his tone. So I always start my economic arguments with a dispassionate look at the trends. And it does read appropriately in his style. But then it also goes on to make up facts. So these kinds of things will very quickly say, like, all right, poorest 15% of Americans fell more, so on and so forth. And that's actually easy for us to check. And so if these kinds of articles were proliferating, we have kind of two different strategies as a sort of computer science community to deal with it. So one of them is fact checking, and there's work ongoing, and there's a pretty active community on this where they basically say, like, well, if there's a statement here, can I go and actually verify it? But the easier thing to do is actually anything that's generated by a machine and not by a person has telltale signs. So I'm showing here on the left and on the right two different passages. One that was generated by, it's an actual New York Times article, and then the other is something that was generated by a machine. And the colors indicate how unlikely the next word is. So the darker the color, the sort of more surprised that a machine learning model is that this is the next word to come. And what we see is that the humans have basically reasonably interesting vocabulary choices. And so there's actually this fair amount of red and purple on screen. And though completely fluent, the sort of somewhat more prototypical and sort of generic sounding language of a machine ends up coming out in this kind of yellow and green coloring. And so this is just to say that if it was the case that bots meant, oh, we have got a bunch of these articles that are being completely generated by machines, and that's what we're concerned about, we would actually have techniques to handle that. This is also true in the sort of multimodal context. And so we've all heard a lot about deep fakes. I mean, I pulled this example from Wikipedia because they're so sort of present in the culture. That's actually, again, reasonably easy for us to detect. What's actually very hard is when humans make content. And so here is multimedia content. This is part of a challenge that Facebook is running right now on detecting hateful memes. So your wrinkle cream is working great as a meme on an alligator is actually incredibly difficult for a system to understand because there's nothing about the text that indicates that it's negative. It's completely this sort of context. And it's also novel, so it's not sort of using just a couple of key sort of derogatory terms that we can automatically pull from. And so the big question, I think, becomes if we're going to actually use these sort of technologies of like language understanding and so forth and machine learning in a positive way in this conversation, I'm going to highlight a couple of other people's work that I think is trying to do that very constructively. So one of them is how do we move beyond really simple notions of kind of toxicity in order to detect more fine-grained or more nuanced notions. And so if you're on the web, there are things like Perspective API, which you can see on the left here, can very sort of correctly figure out that a comment, whether or not it's for or against climate change, that's written as this is a divisive topic, it's something that we can fix and so forth, is a non-toxic statement. And how can you be so stupid is toxic. But what those existing technologies are not good at, and what this particular paper that hasn't even been presented yet does try to look at, is what about the sort of long tail of things? So if people are using new made-up terms, in this case like holohoax, in order to sort of deny the Holocaust happening, or if they're making jokes, are using slurs, how do you detect those, and how do you detect them in the right context? So there's a very big difference between someone from an in-group stating a joke and someone from an out-group stating the joke. And so you have to use all of that additional context. And the plot here is just simply showing the extent to which those are sort of missed by existing technologies. Also, to kind of lend credence again to why it's important to listen to people like Kathleen, this is recent work that she has that I think is really nice, where you're looking at the role of hashtags. So what this work does is it shows basically hashtag propagation. So this was a specific analysis of the Kashmiri conflict recently between India and Pakistan. And you look at Twitter to see to what extent there's enough hashtags that are pro-India versus pro-Pakistan, pro-war versus pro-peace. And then if you can do that, then you can actually track to what extent different parties and sentiments are changing throughout the news cycle. And so these are the kinds of places where I think we can actually start to be helpful. I don't actually think that we're sort of in a situation where we need to be looking out for these bots in the sense of completely artificial statements that are being made, but rather we have to look out for bots that are sort of aware of these kinds of dynamics and that are driving this kind of polarization. And that's the kind of stuff where we can look at aggregate statistics in order to actually find that, and where policymakers or leaders more generally can actually maybe try to step in and diffuse the situation. This is a huge area, and so as one last kind of plug to some of this, there's even an entire course that's being taught this semester within LTI on how do you track political sentiments using machine learning. How do we see these things trending? And again, I want to drive home that this is actually very difficult. There's a particularly new trend of things like hashtag hijacking, where you find out what hashtags your opponents are using, and then you use them on your messaging in order to force them to see your content. And so that's kind of where the state of natural language, machine learning, computer vision are in terms of trying to understand the kind of nuanced messaging that's out there. But again, the real crux of this is what makes it hard is that it's people, not that it is generated automatically. So with that, I will hand it over.
Excellent. And if you now we're ready for Daniel Castro.
Great. Thanks, Scott. And thanks to CMU for the opportunity to be part of this conversation today. I wanted to start by giving an overview of some of the very concrete examples we've seen of local disinformation in particular in the US in recent years. This is something that many social media platforms have really been struggling to address. And I think what's interesting here is we often hear about the national stories, but this is also something that's happening on a very local level. So to give a couple of examples here, over the summer, we saw a number of specific local sources claiming that the wildfires on the West Coast were being started by leftist activists. As a result of this, we saw this on Facebook, we saw this on Twitter, multiple examples of this. And then the local police stations were being overwhelmed with calls from their citizens asking, should we be concerned about arsonists? What should we be doing? Suspicious reportings of people walking around and people claiming they might be protesters. And there was a real need then for these local officials to step in, go on social media, correct the record, and talk to local journalists to set the record straight. We also saw in Colorado a lot of concern about different types of ballots that were going out. So they would take something that was somewhat legitimate. They have pictures of official ballots going out, one in blue and one in red, and people were misinterpreting that and then posting about it, saying that this was these different ballots were printed in different colors, so that state officials could see if somebody was a registered Republican or a registered Democrat, and then mishandle their ballot in response. So a lot of misinformation on that, causing people to wonder whether or not they should actually vote by mail, even though Colorado had been doing this for quite a while. And we saw really countless examples of this happen over the summer. Some of this was kind of, you'd see pure fiction, and then other times, the concerns that you see expressed on social media are based on some kind of legitimate concern or have some kind of kernel of truth, which makes it very difficult to intervene. To Jonathan's point, these are often, human-caused errors. So, for example, a lot of people are very concerned about government surveillance. They're very concerned about privacy, and they're not sure what was going to happen during the pandemic. And we saw lots of conspiracy theories this summer around, for example, in Wisconsin, people saw security cameras going up, and they thought this was a city trying to ensure that nobody was breaking quarantine. And they were concerned that this was now cameras being used to surveil their movements in public. There were concerns that contact tracers were calling homes and that they were going to be working with the Children Protective Services to take children away from their parents. People were afraid to download the contact tracing apps because they thought government might be selling this data to the private sector. Lots of misinformation like that, very prevalent online. And what we see is that it's, of course, very hard to get that truthful information out there faster. The other area that we see kind of a growing recognition of an emerging threat is around deep fakes. I was going to play a clip here to show just how advanced some of this has become. This is a clip that was created to show a speech that was written for Nixon in the event that the Apollo 11 mission had failed.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace.
So you can see just from that small clip how detailed and realistic the capabilities are now. And some of this technology, a few years ago, you had to be more of a specialist to do. But increasingly, it's something that anyone can spend some time learning how to do it and start making these clips. And we've seen, of course, not only this challenge of deepfakes over the last election cycle start to emerge, but also, what's been most prevalent so far in elections is cheap fakes. So the Nancy Pelosi video of her appearing to look drunk, the video of Biden, various videos of Biden where it appears that he said things that he didn't actually say, where they're just using simple video editing techniques. But the point there is, it used to be that you would tell people, well, believe what you can see. And now people aren't sure if they can trust what they see with their own eyes. And so I think that's the challenge that local officials are faced with, is that they now have to think, how can they respond to this type of environment? So there's a few things I'll mention, and we can get more into this in the discussion. One is that you have to be prepared to respond very quickly. So the most successful local officials were the ones that had a rapid response. When they started getting the calls to the police agency, they immediately went on social media and corrected the record. Rumors spread very fast. The second is they're engaging with local media. Sometimes government is a trusted source, sometimes it's not, but local journalists often are. And so when local journalists have access to the information, they can be the ones to vet the information and get it out to the public. That information is also necessary to come from independent journalists. When you're looking at the new content moderation policies on social media platforms, when they're engaging in fact checking, they have to reference it against something. So if there's not local media that's attesting to the truth of something, it's hard for them to correct the record. There's also opportunities now, in addition to detecting deepfakes, to do more to authenticate legitimate content. There's something called the Content Authenticity Initiative, which is an effort to add metadata to video and photographs and even documents that are shared online, so you can see where it actually came from and trace its origin and provenance. And then when it is distributed on social media, different types of actors can go in and verify that it's legitimate. And finally, probably the most important thing in this space is increasing digital literacy. Right now, we have some digital literacy that focuses on technical skills. We have some civics education that focuses on understanding how our democratic systems work. But we really don't have a good blend of digital literacy and media literacy, where we teach people how to consume information online and how to question it. And we have seen in other countries that have focused on this in the past that that's a very effective technique towards getting people to be responsible consumers of information, so that, again, that human factor isn't what's accelerating the spread of the misinformation, and it's the one that can also stop the spread when they encounter it online. So I'll stop there and have a few more thoughts that I hope we can get into.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. And so I think what we'll do now is we'll move into the panel view, where if all the panelists can unmute and start your video again, we'll begin the Q&A session. All right, let's get started. So the first question I have, this is a question for Kathleen, and then maybe Daniel as well, is in both your work and in sort of your comments, you talked about how this idea, this concept of social cybersecurity, and really from a sort of policy lens of this, or sort of government operations, it really seems that there needs to be a blend between what we traditionally see as cybersecurity that addresses certain concerns, and where this really is living is on social media platforms. So that pulls in a conversation around communications officials, those who run social media handles for agencies and others. So talk a little bit about how this is a new challenge and requires a new level of thinking for local, state, and federal officials.
So social cybersecurity has been recognized by the national academies as a new emerging field of science. And it's very distinct from traditional cybersecurity, because traditional cybersecurity focuses on hacking the machine, on looking at packet flows, on looking at denial of service attacks and things like that. Social cybersecurity is more on the human side. To be sure, there's a small linkage between the two areas, but social cybersecurity, which is not all public affairs, it's actually also involves, if you were in the military, it would involve intelligence operations as well, is actually focused on involving the language technology, the social network analysis, the machine learning, the pure data mining of cross social media platforms, looking at both content and also looking at very critically who is talking to whom on these platforms, and therefore spreading the information.
Great, thank you. And moving to sort of a more policy-oriented question, we'll sort of toggle between policy questions and technical questions. So this is for Daniel and Nicole. Both of you talked a little bit about how big an issue this was in 2016, which feels like 40 years ago, not 4. But I think, and Nicole, you started this line of sort of inquiry. It was a really critical issue. Where have we come? Talk a little bit about success and failures over the last 4 years, given how important this was then. It will surely be important in the 2020 election. So give us a little sense of where we've come over the last 4 years.
Well, it's interesting, Scott, and Daniel just pinged me to go first and then he'll follow up. What I think is interesting is I don't think we've made as much progress that we would have liked to have made within this 4 years, and I'll tell you why. I mean, Congress has basically been in a standstill between all of the partisanship. We've not really taken on, I think, some of the really strong legislation that would have really helped us to identify misinformation, disinformation, and ad buys. Since Cambridge Analytica, that was a big issue in terms of being able to affiliate a particular ad with a particular person, right, or organization. And I think what's actually happened in the last 4 years, which I don't want to discredit as progress, but I don't think it's going to actually stop the conversations that my colleagues have actually put forth, which is we really haven't seen strong legislation around this, right? We've seen more best practices, best foot forward, companies like Reddit, Facebook, Google, others, Twitter, saying, we are not either going to run the ad if it's politically motivated, as Facebook just announced, or we're going to tell you who's actually purchasing it. That makes sense, but there's still, I think, a lot of obscurity if we actually don't really have strong election interference rules as well as election security rules. And we have seen in this last 7 months that the call for that, as we're now experiencing a lot of election insecurities around mail-in ballots, which are totally legal and fine, I think this is going to be just another one of those issues that sort of finds itself, I don't want to say minimized, but just finds, like, I keep calling these issues, they like sort of shoot out into space, right? And they find some orbital existence and they don't come back, quick enough, right? They have to go a couple of rounds before we actually take it seriously. I also think the other part that has become a little bit more worrisome since the last 4 years is that algorithms have really lacked transparency. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in all of the scientific presentations of my colleagues is that there's an amplification of science and AI or messaging that is actually creating the space in which we're in now. And it's just gotten more sophisticated. I mean, people, I know you're going to talk about policymakers. Policymakers have tried to impose some pressure to companies to be more transparent about those models. But I think that people have skirted around it. I mean, we have so much data that's collected about people, even in this last 7 months. Companies know more about us than we probably know about ourselves, from the movies that we watch, the food that we eat, the virus diagnosis that we've gotten, how many times we've taken the test, where we live. I'm really concerned the last 4 years that technology has actually advanced before policy. And as a result, misinformation, disinformation will continue to be unhinged, particularly as we're seeing in the last presentation that Jonathan brought up around just some, manipulation of content. What Daniel talked about, manipulation of video. What we talked about in terms of deepfakes legislation 2 years ago, a year ago, is not deepfakes today. So that's really my concern in the 4 years. I think we've raised awareness, but we have not yet come up with real solid solutions that sort of reel this in, or at least bring some transparency to these processes.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I agree, we haven't come far enough. I think one of the challenges is that we haven't seen laws that people actually agree on will be effective. And I think that's one of the challenges in this space. Where we have seen some laws, so we've seen a couple of state laws around deepfakes, Texas and California both passed deepfake laws that basically said, in the run-up to an election, you can't have a rival campaign sending a deepfake or creating deepfakes that makes their opponent look like they said something they didn't say, which should be a fairly benign argument, and even that is controversial to a lot of people, and whether that impinges on free speech rights. I think those laws were crafted pretty carefully, but that shows the challenges of even doing federal laws in this space. I think one of the challenges we saw in 2016 was that the social media platforms were very unprepared for this challenge. And I think that's where there's a really big opportunity for government to lead in this space, because there's a lot that the private sector can do to try and moderate this content, to try and remove it, to label it, figure out what is effective and do what's effective, but they can't do all that research by themselves. We need federal funding in that space so that we can have the academic research to support the best practices, so that the long tail of different types of online platforms out there can start adopting these practices. That's something that I think is really underappreciated. We often talk about Facebook and Twitter, but we've seen Twitch get in on the game about moderating content. We're seeing Animal Crossing and these other games where there's political activity occurring on them, and these aren't platforms that were necessarily designed for political engagement. And so trying to figure out the right way to moderate it is very difficult, especially when the content is incredibly complex. It's ephemeral, so it's not something that you can always go back and check and review like you can with some other things like Twitter. And also some of this is real-time communication. So the ability to actually preemptively review it, and you don't have a 5-second censorship button that you can do when you're engaged in these things. And of course, some of this is also fully encrypted. So you see disinformation spreading on apps like WhatsApp, where it's fully encrypted, and the ability to actually monitor that really doesn't exist. So there's many technical challenges in this space, which I think make it difficult for both the platforms and the policymakers to intervene. And so, again, what I think we need in this space is much more research, because it's not going to be solved individually by any of these tech companies on their own.
Excellent. That's great. Jonathan and Kathleen, and for any of you, you can dive into these questions if you have thoughts, for sure. But Jonathan, let me target this question to you, and others jump in. So talk to us a little bit about, we'll call it the arms race between offensive activities and defensive activities. Who's winning, and where are you optimistic, or are you pessimistic? Where's the sort of current state of play, and what are the next year or couple years going to look like? And I'm sure Kathleen and others will have thoughts on that as well.
I think, so I think what I'll probably do is try to first narrow down and define some of those terms. So I want to be really careful about who's the we and what aspects of arms race we're talking about. So kind of as I was noting before, right? We use the term bot very generically. We use the terms about sort of manipulation very generically. There's a pretty big spectrum in all of those things. And so if the question was about sort of like, again, as I said, completely generated, I'm not worried about any of that. So assuming a human is in the loop, are the technologies getting better and easier to use for sort of spreading disinformation in various ways? Yes. In terms of the arms race component of the question, that presupposes that every player is actively working on it as hard as they should. And so there's a difference between sort of saying academic researchers are figuring out technologies to do this and platforms are actually implementing these things. And I can't speak to what they're doing, but I don't think that those are the same thing. So the reason I want to make that distinction is because if the question, sorry to be like overly academic and maybe pedantic about dissecting this, but if the question is basically, can I detect a falsehood on the internet? That technology is getting better. Can I detect that something is basically, is trying to provoke a response? That technology is getting better. If I want to actually act on it, that's where network effects come in, and that's where it's a kind of a different conversation, and that's where the platforms really have a lot of responsibility. So, for example, something that may not pass the AI test because it's a joke or something like this to one population, but it's offensive to another population, is still the kind of thing which, if you have network effects data, you should be able to detect. So if you had 100,000 people all simultaneously weirdly share the same joke, that's the kind of thing that Facebook or Twitter should be able to detect, and they should be able to sort of like actually start to look into, even if the AI itself says like, actually, this is kind of a tough case. I can't detect it. So it's kind of a non-answer, but it kind of depends on who we're actually asking about. Kathleen maybe has more concrete thoughts on what to actually do about that.
So I would say that in the short run, I would say in the short run, we're actually losing the arms race, in part because new techniques are being created for creating, sharing, spreading, and new platforms for sharing and spreading disinformation are coming about so rapidly and so quickly from throughout the world, and we're not even aware of most of it. And because of the way we can study these kinds of things, we're very, very limited in not having access to the kind of data that is needed to study them over long enough periods and so on. So I'd say in the short run, things can be bad. The other thing I would say is to keep in mind that disinformation, though, is very much driven by events. So we're starting to get a handle on, and people are starting to stop disinformation regarding, say, medical-related issues and COVID-19. However, with the next event that occurs, there'll be a whole new slew of those, and it's kind of like the whole situation will start all over again.
Can I just add to expand on Kathleen's care? I want to drive this point home about the data, right? So who has this data, right? The platforms are the ones who have this data, right? They know who's talking about what, they know who's connected with whom, and they know who's sharing what content, even if it's not an explicit share, right? So if, for example, I copy and paste someone else's post and reshare it, that's the kind of stuff that they can track that the rest of us sort of don't have access to. So again, that sort of the responsibility there in terms of upping that side of the arms race, I think actually falls pretty heavily on platforms right now.
Great, thank you.
Can I add one thing to whatever was happening? I think that's interesting what we've talked about so far in terms of who owns this data and the extent to which these are driven by events. We did a paper at Brookings like a couple years ago on social network analysis and hashtags and the extent to which people actually align themselves with particular hashtags, and if there was any brokers that existed between different politically charged conversations. In this case, we looked at the conversation around net neutrality. What we actually found is that there's very little connection between people who have different views too, right? And I wanted to add this to this conversation because I think that's where disinformation is so effective, right? Because the internet in many respects has polarized or fenced in in ideologies and they fenced in activities that allow people to become much more vulnerable and marginalized in the process. So in this case of net neutrality, for example, what we found is that people who were for net neutrality tend to have a web of associations, from legislators to civil society groups to individuals like Aunt Betsy, right, that were pretty much supporters of that, with very little in-between conscience of the in-between people that could actually break that filter bubble or break that conversation. What scares me about the use of AI, and I kind of want to go to this arms race conversation, I think it's so important to actually understand the power of AI in being able to both identify what conversations are going on, but also to manipulate the networks in which those conversations happen. And so what we saw in 2016, we saw people targeted not just by where they stood in terms of a candidate, but we also saw them targeted based on what environment, like who were their likes, their affinity groups, their conversations.
Right.
And it was sort of like they were infiltrated because people were having different conversations. I tell people, and I'll close here, like, I always think of algorithmic amplification like a playground, right? There's slides, there's monkey bars, there's, you know, swings, there's a sandbox, and all of us love to play in the playground, right? But if we look at the internet and platforms today, the monkey bars have the white supremacists, the slides have the Black Lives Matter enthusiasts. Lifestyle folks might be in the sandbox, but we all exist in the same sandbox. We all have different ideologies that sort of align with where we are in the sandbox. And so I think that, to me, is one of the most dangerous parts about being exploited through misinformation, because you believe what your friends and your networks also tell you. And I think that's where you have to figure out, you know, how do you make this much less opaque and you really bring it to the forefront. So I'm a sociologist, but I had to jump in there with these technologists because that.
I won't belabor this point. I'll let Scott control again, but I think I want to piggyback on that one other kind of component, right? Which is, there's also this question when we talk about the arms race about how difficult it is to do that targeting if the platform enables or doesn't enable it, right? So there's also a big difference between a platform basically saying we've already run, because of micro ad targeting, a bunch of AI techniques in order to basically isolate and identify all these, and I'm going to now let you choose that, versus even if the technology is technically there to do it because it was there for ads, if I don't make that available in this context, that's actually, you know, what's possible versus what you can do are very different, right? So it's actually, it's going to be very difficult for a data science team of a campaign to basically rebuild that infrastructure, if impossible, because they don't actually have access to the full network. And so this is, again, one of these places where just because the AI enables it doesn't mean that we have to market it. It doesn't mean that we have to make that available.
Right.
I could just add to that. I think one of the challenges, though, is there's been a lot of talk on the policy side about how we can regulate this, and there's often proposals to limit platforms from doing targeted political ads. I mean, that's one proposal that's definitely out there. And the challenge with that, of course, is that we're seeing in general with advertising, you know, the move towards influencer-based advertising. So you can say you can't do a targeted ad to a certain group for political speech, but if you can pay an online influencer to make your argument for you, it has the same effect, right? So you still end up having money in politics, and in fact, it becomes even more opaque because you're no longer tracking it through these digital platforms. So I think one of the concerns that I have in this space is, as we look for solutions, we have to be concerned about some of the unintended consequences, because some of the proposals that are out there, I think, are very well intentioned about getting maybe money out of politics or getting more transparency in this space. But we have to think about, again, you know, these are, you know, some of these are very organized people who are trying to game the system, and they're not just going to go away when we change the rules. They're going to try and game the system again. They're going to try and hack the system again. And so we need to be aware of what those vulnerabilities are as we start making policy changes and technical changes.
And I want to just have a final follow-up on that, simply to say that a lot of the concern here is, and a lot of the discussion is focused on the content of the messages, what is being marketed, the memes that are used, the statements that are being made, and how those are prioritized or searched, or how the algorithms can affect those. In point of fact, a lot of the things that are done to spread disinformation are actually done prior to any of that by simply creating groups in social media without people being aware of it. So for example, during the Euromaidan revolution, there's this group of young guys did not know each other. All they had in common was the simple fact that each one of them liked to send out posts with light porn images of women. Okay, and so AI was actually used to start mentioning all of these guys to each other and at the same time in the same post, which caused them to be prioritized and created a group where there was none. And then once it was created, they got them involved in, told them where to go get guns and how to get involved in the revolution. So it's not just about content, and to the extent that our policies and the extent that we as academicians focus only on content, we're missing 50% of what's going on or more.
Great. So I want to make sure, while I'm sure we could continue on this one question for the last half hour, I want to make sure that we get a chance to pull in some of the questions from the audience. So we've got a bunch of questions. I'm just going to start. I'm going to sort of either ask one of you, or I think many of these, anyone who wants to jump in. So this, and I'll just kind of go in as I'm sort of reading these in real time. So this is a great question. When people are confronted about sharing disinformation, it is often received with embarrassment, shame, or anger from the party that shared disinformation. Do you have any tips for intervening without further amplifying divisiveness? So in other words, when people are confronted with the fact that they've been spreading disinformation, that the response to that is hostile, which could further the underlying problem. Any thoughts for ways of intervening?
Well, this is NICOL. I mean, I think that it's important, and I think it was mentioned by Daniel, to have like this citizen education, right? I think the same way we talked about digital literacy and, you know, what digital civics looks like, we have to actually talk about this. I mean, I'm one of those people, right? I share people who died like 10 years ago as if it was yesterday. And what happens is, after someone has alerted me that the article is dated 10 years, you know, I quietly take it down. But the person who's asked the question is actually correct. I mean, my mother does it all the time. She's in one of those age groups that spreads disinformation all the time. The question is, how do you do that in a way where you actually maintain the integrity of people's opinions and you allow people to, you know, not be shamed in the process? And I think that's where we need these protocols around this. I think the reason that this has somewhat got out of hand on the side of civil society is because we don't know. We take for granted that what platforms tell us are accurate and real. And I think the things that we've seen social media platforms do in terms of fact checkers, do you know where this information is coming from? Those are sort of those checks and balances to make sure citizens are aware of these information. But like you said, Scott, earlier, in terms of what has happened between the 2016 election and 2020, I would suggest the same thing has happened between what happened 10 years ago when it came to digital literacy education and now. We seem to not keep up to speed on the fact that we have to have algorithmic training so people understand why algorithms follow you from your email to your Facebook to your social media, other social media platforms. We need to have disinformation training. And I think if we could do anything, we need to bring that back to young people who can actually guide us in creating better frameworks for how we actually distill information. Because as someone mentioned, I think one of the previous presentations, some of the stuff people can actually do from their, you know, the couch. This is not complicated stuff that people are actually doing. And so I think the extent to which we actually let people know that this is something that can happen in that respect really makes us a better informed democracy.
Great.
So oftentimes confronting people directly is not the right strategy. In fact, it often doesn't stop the spread of disinformation. Rather, another approach is simply to train them ahead of time and to in a more neutral setting in terms of what is the best way to approach things, how to think twice before sending, how to fact check.
Excellent.
Very, very minor comment just based off of the comment about literacy. This is definitely also one of the things I think is interesting generationally. I think a lot of this discussion you were saying about like sort of ourselves or our parents doing things, right? So there is a lot more discussion, I think, among, for instance, sort of Gen Z and some of millennials about the notion that everything is algorithmically controlled and tailored. And so that means that you're going into content consumption with that understanding. And even if that doesn't sort of resolve the issue, it does mean that you already have a slightly more skeptical eye, or you're maybe expecting something to then get changed or verified, versus if you're used to or assuming that platforms are always trustworthy or that they are universal, then you don't have that context, which makes this conversation harder.
Got it. And let's turn to another question. So the question is, what specific information or types of information is spread that is used to depress turnout? So the examples that the person who asked the question give is this something like attacking Hillary Clinton in general, or referring to her as secretly racist? Or so the sort of underlying question here is, what are the types of tactics, topics, or procedures that tend to be deployed most often to depress turnout or target, as NICOL and others were saying, specific groups?
So actually it ranges dramatically and depends on the kind of group it is. So this can include such things as out and out statements about lies about where you actually go to vote, lies about what the content, about how to vote, disinformation about actually registration. So for example, they scared off a bunch of people from registering by claiming that if you went and registered, they would take away your gun if they thought you had one. You know, and statements like that. Other things, so there's that whole cadre. Another set of cadre that stops people are ones making you feel that your vote won't matter, that you're not really part of the society, the civil discourse. So this is often aimed at, particularly at ethnic and minority women, are often, sent various messages that basically imply that their vote isn't going to count and that there's no candidate who's there for them, so why should they be involved, as an example. And then, the out and out conspiracy theories, we don't know exactly how much those actually, impact voting at all. But it is true that misinformation that is spread by your friends and neighbors, or by those that you believe are people you know but you don't really online, that suggest that you shouldn't vote, it can be very impactful as well.
If I could add to that, Scott, too, I think Kathleen is correct in terms of just the direct misleading of polling locations, particularly for this election. What we saw, for example, which I think is really concerning as well, is just the deep learning and the deep mind stuff that happened in terms of the imaging, the manipulation of not just voice, but the coloring of skin of Hillary Clinton to make her look evil, the backgrounds in which she was in. And I think going into this election was also interesting, added to what Kathleen is talking about, are these inferential assumptions that are also going to target minority groups. When you think about it, I just read an article the other day about people who have been infected with COVID, for example, being sent messages around, the fact that they cannot vote in person because of COVID. I mean, to me, that is like the ultimate, and I love what Kathleen said, it's like the ultimate setup, right, for populations to already be within these groups. And I think the same thing, that's why I made my point around domestic disinformation. Supremacist groups that are now really feeling conspiracy theories against Blacks and Latinos because of what they think will be dominant. I mean, this is all real, right? And I love the fact that the engineers point to the fact that these are aggregated responses that have come as a result of a lot of planning, which I want to make sure as we're in this panel that we really don't dismiss the fact, particularly with foreign operators, as well as where we're seeing in terms of domestic disinformation being spread even by this president, is that this feeds off of the historical legacies that have been made known to man about the oppression of groups. And when you actually prey upon people's vulnerabilities historically, that's why many of these campaigns are very successful. They already know where those areas of sensitivities are. That's why, as Kathleen and Yanat said, when someone gets shot in the Black community and a hashtag movement starts, that becomes a point of, interference in terms of more disinformation to either keep people on the street to do more harm or to minimize their movement and resistance. And so I think that it's really important for this panel, for people who are listening, to understand as a sociologist how I look at it. This is the preying upon the historical vulnerabilities and conscience of the United States by actors who sort of know where the blind spots are. And until we actually face that reality, I think we're going to actually see more and more of it, because it's going to go, it's beyond did Prince die this year or did he die, last year, to how do we actually stop people from exercising democratic rights?
Excellent.
I can give just one very concrete example of this too. I mean, in 2016, one of the most egregious ones that I saw was targeted at Hispanic voters. They were often social media ads in Spanish telling Hispanic voters that vote for Hillary Clinton by texting this number. And you could not vote by text. And but there were ads that said paid for by Hillary Clinton, obviously false, just directly telling people on social media, this is how you can vote. And so people would vote and by text thinking they were done and that they had done their civic service. So I think that kind of is just very clearly, concretely showing the harm that can occur.
Yeah, totally. I think that's these are excellent points, and I got to just jump in and say, to Nicole's and Daniel, I think's point earlier that a lot of these are age-old tactics on new platforms. I got to give the quick anecdote. I worked in southern Texas on a 2008 campaign, and Hispanic voters were being told that they needed to bring 3 forms of identification to vote. So Daniel's story is the exact same that we've seen in many arenas, but it's in a much more digital format, which translates to another question that we get from the audience, very open-ended for anyone. What does the digital town hall look like of the 21st century? And sort of an extension of that, another question around how guarded am I from these actors and messages if I'm not very engaged in social media? So I think bringing those two questions together, what I'd love the panel to respond to is, how do we create, to use Nicole's metaphor, how do we create that playground where people are actually on the different equipment and interacting digitally? And second, where are the boundaries of this thing, and how are people who think they aren't being impacted by it, they likely are? So two slightly different angles of a similar question. And anyone want to take a crack at it?
So actually, we know that most people are being impacted by it, even if they're not directly on social media, because they get there, if they go to offline news sources, those offline news sources are getting a lot of their information from online and from social media. If they're going to get the information from their friends are probably on social media and they're getting it from there. So unless they're completely, in a community that is completely off the grid and that is not talking to anyone from outside, they're going to get impacted by things from social media. So, there it is. To relate that back to your town hall, even if you think in order to engage in some kind of online town hall, the important thing to think about here is not just how to engage, but how to ensure that everyone feels equally, not just able, but accepted in engaging. And a lot of the things that are set up now are often aimed at particular questions or particular groups rather than being open to the community at large.
I mean, I'll follow up. I think on the digital town hall question from the viewer, there is probably no such thing with private platforms. I mean, we are all on platforms that are essentially monetized by shareholders. And in many respects, we have made ourselves the product to these companies. And so trying to host a digital town hall that deals with democratic processes and issues is probably going to be impossible on a private platform because of the way that their business models have been designed for marketing to us and micro-targeting us. I think if there was some way to do some type of pure town hall, clearly you got to break the logjam. You have to make it so that you can break some of the filter bubbles and bring people into the same dialogue of concern. And we see that as a researcher, I see that with polling. If I could somehow get pollster work that is actually under, academic guidance into the mainstream, much like what our friends are doing on this call, we actually make it closer. But I think right now it's just a wild, wild west because we're, platform companies in many respects who are vying for the next virtual platform are going to do just like what happened on and if I can, I hope not to offend anybody, what happened with Zoom the first first few months of this pandemic, where we had no choice but to use a private sector application that had a lot of security issues that, you know, also inserted a lot of racist rhetoric into some people's conversations due to the lack of security concerns. So I'm not really confident about a digital town hall. I think we need to figure out ways to optimize digital to have different conversations, but who actually sponsors and hosts that conversation, I think is really going to be critical to whether or not there's some ingenuity that's actually wrapped around that discussion. I just think technology has really just outpaced civility, and it's outpaced democracy in many respects. So we sort of have to return back to some of those values and norms to make it happen.
I'll just, I agree, Nicole, that it's really difficult to do digital town hall on a private platform. I do think, you know, there are tools that, you know, we should be making use of, and certainly at the local level. I mean, when you see city councils, school boards using Zoom or using similar types of platforms to let people come in, I do think they're more accessible for a lot of people who otherwise, you know, couldn't get a babysitter and childcare to come 8 o'clock at night to spend 2 hours at these meetings. So I think the ability to call in and access them online are opening up new opportunities for engagement. But I actually worry that, you know, the problem with these tools is they're designed for control, right? They're not designed for protest. So, you know, it's one thing to go protest at your city council meeting and, you know, not be silent when they say, when they make a call to order it, and kind of have that show of community. When there's a mute button for all, it doesn't work quite the same way. So I think the real challenge is, how do we still have, you know, digital activism in an age of digital town halls?
Well, if I can, I think what your point is, Daniel, is so correct, right? Because there's this difference between social activism that happens online and the extent to which we've actually seen these platforms that weren't designed for this type of resistance and resiliency among certain groups sort of become that base play for them. But we need people to study this, right? Like, how do you actually start with a hashtag movement and make it into productive collective activism? But you also have to recognize that in their a goal of collective activism, let's say in support of Black Lives Matter, there's a whole lot of people who are not. And so I think we have to think about how these platforms allow for the utility of that type of collective action. And then I love what you said. I'm a PTA vice president, and we held our first PTA meeting on Zoom. If you think the ones in person are bad, this was actually really bad, because, you know, no one can like break in and just start talking or arguing and talking about the goal, right? Even though our principle is really great. So I love what you said, right? Right now we're sort of stuck on using these platforms, but you know, the extent to which they allow us, and I think that's why disinformation seeps in, because the technology is not designed for these reciprocal conversations. You don't talk to people who are not like you, and so you cannot engage in that robust dialogue or even counter whether or not what you saw was true or false. So I love what you said. I think we have to find Scott used my analogy, I'm going to put another one out. The meeting of the minds of the technical and the civil society spaces, the sociological spaces and the engineering spaces, to create more interdisciplinary conversation around this, so we can get to a place where we can have these types of talks in a way that we can actually address it more fully.
Okay, to piggyback, having a you know, like the bot sort of army that shows up to support you even when there is a digital platform is sort of like if you showed up to your town hall with your own laugh track or applause, you know, thing or something like this, right? It makes it seem as though you're actually, you know, have this whole background of people that are in support of you, that are boosting this. And this is the kind of thing that, again, is done strategically, algorithmically, and also can be sort of squashed algorithmically. So you really do, so sure, you can be a very loud voice, but unless other genuine people are in support of that, you're not going to bubble up. You're not actually going to be able to steal the sort of the stage, which is, I think, a lot of what we see with like sort of the first comment kind of stuff on things like Twitter, right? Is that you basically want to be able to say, here's this person's message. I'd like to be able to make sure that mine is equally sort of viewed to theirs. And these are kinds of things that we can actually mitigate to improve that experience.
Kathleen, you look like you've got a comment.
I guess I sort of disagree, because what we've seen is that loud voices surrounded by armies of bots can have even without like-minded people, can create like-minded people, because we know that sociologically there's a fraction of people who just want to be led, and that will move and follow any loud voice, particularly if they are in positions of authority. So it's not as simple as just stop the loud voice, stop those armies of bots from promoting things.
Sorry, yes, I completely agree with that. I think that I'm thinking more in terms of basically sort of there's a difference between someone who is a person of authority saying something and having that following gather, and having a sort of automatically generated sequence of sort of responses that happen anytime that a particular hashtag is mentioned or a particular point is mentioned. And so I don't know the exact ratios of those. I completely defer to you in terms of what the sort of ratios of those are on these platforms.
That's right. And if I can jump in, I'm sorry, Scott, just on that. This is, I think, where this gets really real with this upcoming election, right? Because the loudest voice right now on a variety of issues is the voice that, without making this a partisan panel, that is creating a lot of disinformation and misinformation around big things like policing, like the virus. And I totally agree. And I think, Scott, thank you for having this panel, because I think until people realize that much of our digital lives are sort of in these echo chambers, and these echo chambers not just become more aligned with the like-mindedness of groups what Kathleen is talking about, but they also become dangerous, right? And they take on that digital life, much like we used to joke about with avatars, and they think they can go in and stop people from voting, or they think that they can actually show up for voter intimidation, or most recently they can go to a Minneapolis George Floyd protest and start breaking windows to sort of mimic what they think is the resistance that's happening in that place. And so I think, a lot of what we're talking about today does have consequences, and has consequences for really big issues where people need to be safe and they need to be secure in their ability to act out on certain democratic processes or to stay healthy, right, coming forward. So I couldn't resist it as a policymaker who is completely exhausted for this past 3 days. But I think that's what I call like that other thing that's happening in the United States that we're not paying a lot of attention to when we actually go into. We used to think this only happened in other countries, but it's happening. It's going to happen here.
And so with that, let's I got to ask this one last question. If we end up having a few minutes, we'll go back to the audience. But okay, so given where we're at here, with 1 month to go to the election, in the middle of a pandemic where misinformation and disinformation is playing a deadly role, give us one thing or two things, if you want to be ambitious, that you think both viewers of this pod or whatever this is, Zoom meeting, could be doing, and we've got a network of local elected and governors interested in participating in this. So what's one or two things you think, as simple as they may be, that we can do now? And then if you have something that's going to require a little more investment, legislative and otherwise, we'd love to hear that. But what should people do? Well, I'll just start. We'll start with the way the panelists. I'm going to start with you, Kathleen, and then we'll march down the line.
So as a general public, like I said, go and look at, fact check everything, go to Pointers, Snopes, etc. But also, if you start feeling like your emotions are getting in play, you're getting more excited, more happy, you're getting more sad, more depressed, more angry when you're reading posts, take a break from social media, take a break from interview for a day or two to calm your emotions down. Because the way a lot of these systems work is that they bring you into groups and they excite your emotions to get you to start responding emotionally. They like hijack your amygdala, get you respond emotionally rather than getting you respond rationally. And from a policymaker perspective, I would say that you need to start watching messages and maintain, a calm, authoritative, clear, constant, consistent messaging and build your community of others around you who will help, put out those calm, clear, authoritative statements.
Awesome. Nicole?
Yeah, I love what Kathleen said, and I wish I could actually be calm and cool and collective every day. It's just not working, Kathleen. It's just not working. I can't meditate enough because I'm always on Zoom. I think that for the legislators that are actually watching, I would put out this big challenge to you. I think we're focusing a lot on the physical presence, the process of mail-in voting, the process of going to your polling booths, the process of our traditional election security. I really would implore you to actually bring in disinformation as one of your tenets of how you educate people as they prepare to go to the polls. Make sure that people who are overwhelmingly congesting and consuming information online know what Kathleen is talking about, that some of it is inaccurate, that they need to do sort of like, if I had it and I was a marketing guru, I would sort of do this 3-step campaign. Read it, check it, and then go back and check it again, right? Because I think people are going to be in the moment. And what we saw, I think, in the last election, and what we actually saw in some of the midterm elections, was that people did not go to a polling place because of a photo that they might have seen or information that was coming through social media. And so I think it's really important for us to really ground this in reality and add digital to the list of suggested warnings, suggested recommendations or proposals that voters need to enact going forward. I think that's really, really important. And then I think the second advice I would give to all of the people who are listening is listen to the children on TikTok. So I have a 13-year-old who's a TikTok user, and I gotta tell you, I love Beyonce because she can tell you not just the cat videos and who Ariana Grande is watching, but she's very politically astute to how young people are using TikTok to affect change. And if we can get to a state like young people where they're able to articulate, no, mommy, when the TikTok ban was coming on, no, we'll just go on another, we'll just get another IP address, or we'll just figure out another way to do this. I was thinking in my head, how does my child who's learning from her bedroom, who was having breakdowns on the floor after a full day of virtual learning, be able to articulate election information via TikTok? And there's something to be said about how that social media platform is actually translating technology into layperson's language so that people understand where they should be motivated to act. So I'm up for a study on this because I'm seeing it every day. But that would be my 2 bites. Educate your populace and learn from the younger generations on how they're actually communicating technology to lay people.
Beautiful. Thank you. Jonathan.
I mean, so the people who just spoke, or you guys actually know what you're talking about in this space, and so I want to be very careful about making anything that resembles a policy recommendation. That's sort of not I do want to echo that I love TikTok. I think that is a particularly good example because there's a lot of discussion on there about the algorithm. Everyone is acutely aware of its role, and that goes to this comment, so piggybacking about educating there. And then again, not really thinking about or worrying about something being a purely AI artificial, but actually figuring out ways that you can use it to facilitate humans. So for example, something that we can do reasonably well is clustering, right? We can figure out if topics are trending even if they don't use hashtags. And so if you're a policymaker or if you're an official and you are, these kinds of things should be in your toolbox for basically keeping a pulse on how things are changing and what people are talking about, so that you can be very strategic about your messaging. But in terms of what to actually do, again, I defer to Kathleen, NICOL, and so on. Yeah.
I think you're selling yourself short, but that was a good. You had some to-do items in there. Daniel, take us home.
Sure. So, again, I think one of the most important things, especially in the last month, will be having a rapid response center for local officials to get on social media, to be able to respond, to same-day claims. If somebody's saying, hey, this polling site's closed, or, we saw someone coughing there, it looks like they have coronavirus, being able to actually respond in real time to this is important. The days of having, the intern manage the social media accounts are over. Longer term, it's going to be things like, getting deepfake legislation out there to address this, doing media literacy. And then I think, one of the most important things is really reforming some of the laws around voting and access to ballots for people. We need no-fault absentee voting for everyone. We need to have same-day voter registration. Done a lot of work looking at, how you make elections accessible for everyone kind of across the board. And those are the 2 most important policy changes that can be made to make it easier for people to vote. And the third is allowing them to actually, bring information with them into the polls so that they can actually be able to vote in accordance with their own preferences. Most people aren't going to remember a list of 30 candidates, especially when you get to some of these downstream local ballots. And the only way they can do that is if they have information that they can actually bring in with them, or sometimes even look up information while they're there, or again, if they're being able to vote remotely, then they can do that in the comfort of their home with their own mobile devices and get access to the information they need to make informed decisions. That is one of the biggest challenges in terms of voting, is actually just giving people the tools they need so that they can make informed choices. And there's a lot more work we can do in that space. And the evidence is very clear on how to achieve it.
Excellent. And I encourage folks to get on ITIF's website to check out some of the work Daniel's done on that. And NICOL's work's obviously on brookings.edu, and cmu.edu has all the rest of our work. So just two mega takeaways. There's been a ton of great content throughout the afternoon, and we'll be sending, like I said, a follow-up on some major action items that we think both local elected officials and everyone can do. But I would say sort of the two big takeaways that I had was one, there is a role for local and municipal and state elected officials, and part of that role is exactly what Daniel just said, which is being able to respond rapidly, professionalize the communications team in such a way to be able to respond in a way that's effective and in real time. But I think the sort of upshot is this is part of your job as a local elected official, ensuring a safe, effective, and transparent and accurate election process is something that everyone should consider as part of their job in the last 30 days. And then for the rest of the audience, my big sort of takeaway is there actually is a huge amount each of us can do. We talked a lot about education. Kathleen gave that great example of, these tactics work when you're fired up. So take a step back, and maybe even one step further as we think about what it really means to be a citizen these days. Most of us, almost all of us, I hope it be true, wouldn't go out in public without a mask on, or we think voting is important. There's a series of things we do just as part of being a citizen now, and this is one of those new things on how we have a responsible social media influence account and otherwise. It's just part of being a citizen these days, along the lines of those other things that we've had to adjust to. So again, I'd like to thank all the panelists. We got to well over 130 participants, which is fantastic. We'll be sending out some information to sort of codify the conversation. But thank you, Kathleen, NICOL, Jonathan, Daniel, and our co-sponsor, Ideas at CMU. Really appreciate everyone's time. Have a great afternoon.